how many, I know a few people here, but how many know me? I can see Lynn there, I can see you, I can see that guy there, of course, yeah. As your professor has told you, my name is Peter Oruka. He actually got hold of me somewhere and invited me to come and, just share my thoughts on this topic we're going to learn from next week on sage philosophy. Well, sage philosophy is basically a brainchild of Oruka, who happens to be my dad. And so, it's basically, I've grown up around, just trying to build interest around this discipline and find out more about it. So I thought it would be a good idea if, I just came and, shared my thoughts on this. So basically, I don't know if you mind if I stand up, but, so this is a very broad topic. I'm even, I'm kind of thinking, where should I start or how should I go about this? But basically, sage philosophy is an expression of thoughts or a way of thinking, which basically fluctuates between popular wisdom. Popular wisdom basically meaning, maxims, aphorisms, and, common sense truths. And popular wisdom and didactic wisdom. Didactic wisdom basically involves wise men and women transcending communal wisdom. So even before I go into that, the professor advised me to talk about Henry Oruka as a person. Now, well, Henry Oruka, or Dad, as we call him, was a very charming individual. One of the reasons why, he was able to endear himself to so many people is because he had a very good heart, but equally good mind as well. He was born in 1944, 1st June 1944, in Western Nyanza in Ugenya, a village called Masiro Nyangungu, Oruka village, because my grandfather is called Oruka Ranginya. So in Luo, we normally name a village after, the person who has a home, sort of created a homestead there. And there are various processes when it comes to having your own home. As a man, there are certain processes which involves a father or a male relatives which have to be performed. These are such as tudolum. Tudolum basically means tying the grass. So it's a male, either an uncle of yours or a father who has to do this. Now, these practices nowadays, some are practiced, some are not, and this is all thanks to, slowly and slowly people realizing that they should depend on alternatives given by, sages in the communities on whether or not to retain certain, practices. And so, yeah, born in 1st June 1944, grows up basically in Ugenya. He goes to Sega. There's a primary school called Sega Primary School. And then later goes to St. Mary's Yala, very popular for rugby nowadays. Mm-hmm. And then from there he goes, passes through Kenyatta High School before going to Uppsala. Uppsala University is in Sweden, where he first of all did geography, geodesy, before going to Wayne State for his master's. Now he graduated, he went to Uppsala around 1965. At the age of 21, graduated 68, 69, goes for his master's to Wayne State at around 25. He was around 25 years old. Goes back to Uppsala for his doctorate. In 1970, the same 1970 clears his PhD and comes back to Nairobi and becomes a 26-year-old professor. Now, at the time, around the 60s, the prevailing knowledge on philosophy was basically derived from anthropological and theological literature, basically literature based on religion. Then early 70s, of course, we had John Beatty. How many have heard of John Beatty? Reverend, John Beatty, masquerading to be a professor. Anyway, so John Beatty had his text on African religions and philosophy, which basically did not distinguish between, philosophy and religion. So, around the same time, Henry Oruka in 1971 wrote on mythologies as African philosophy, and later published this around 1974. This was basically a polemical attack on, John Beatty and Placid Temples. There was a European by the name Placid Temples who wrote on Bantu philosophy. And basically for Temples, he was trying to say, or he claimed that he discovered philosophy among the Bantu, which was a sort of unique and was consistent. But unlike his predecessors, what he basically did was to find rationality in the irrational. So he didn't quite distinguish between African philosophy and African religion. So, you see, then in around 1974, Henry Odera he started a project, and the project was under the title Thoughts of Traditional Kenyan Sages. So what was this about? This was about going into villages and trying to find wise men and women who were recognized as being wise, and trying to find out whether or not they were actually capable of transcending, communal wisdom. And this project was actually quite successful, because we had initially at the University of Nairobi, there was the chairman of the department then, under the name Reverend Dr. Bishop Stephen Neal. Now, when my dad came back to Kenya and started teaching at the University of Nairobi in 1970, he was with a gentleman called Dr. Ngasani. Now, they were first appointed as tutorial assistants. And, Reverend, Stephen Neal used to like referring to them as our two African assistant tutorial assistants. They used to sort of please the boss to Lord such levels. But eventually, Stephen Neal was replaced by Joseph Donders in around 1974. Joseph Donders was very supportive of this project on Thoughts of Traditional Kenyan Sages, and even offered departmental support. This was very beneficial even to him as an individual, because in his inaugural lecture it was dubbed "Don't Fence Us In, the Liberating Role of Philosophy." He actually mentions some sages who were interviewed during this project. So 1973, Philosophical Association of Kenya is, founded. And, my dad is appointed president of this. 1974, there's a journal which is launched, dubbed Thought and Practice journal. Currently it's online. They managed to get it up and running again. So that's Thought and Practice. Just go and Google it if you're on free time. So, back to this subject of sage philosophy. As I mentioned, this is a way of thinking or an expression of thoughts which fluctuates between didactic wisdom and popular wisdom. And as I mentioned, popular wisdom has to do with, to use very simple language, basically what everyone else knows. Everyone knows the library is there, cafeteria is there, Rosie's somewhere down there, there's Mama, what's it called again? Ghost dishes? Yeah, just around the corner. But didactic wisdom has to do with transcending all that, transcending communal wisdom. You know, can you come up with solutions? Can you think outside the box? You know, can you offer an alternative to what we already have? Can you offer Vision 2030 after a Messinyayo regime, for instance? So that's what popular wisdom and didactic wisdom are about. Now, there have been some scholars who have also written texts on, you know, philosophy and what they, you know, think, you know, philosophy is all about. We've had people like, you know, Barry Hallen, J.O. Sodipo, who have written texts like, for instance, we've had The Mind of the Savage by, you know, Sodipo. We've had Primitive Philosophy by Kwame Gyekye. We've had, Primitive Philosophy, Philosophy of the Savage, written 1938, thereabout. So, the problem with some West African philosophers was one, they did not mention names of the sages they interviewed. Now the problem here is you cannot counter check or make reference when you're deliberating with your colleagues. That's the problem with this. You know, unlike the Kenyan project, which had, you know, identified particular sages who you could attribute certain ideas to. For instance, the Kenyan project named people like Ogotomili, Masi Griole, Ogotomili. How many have heard of Ogotomili? Well, Ogotomili was classified as a folk sage. We have folk sage and philosophic sage. Now, when I mentioned popular wisdom, in that we have the folk sage, but when I mentioned didactic wisdom, that's where we have the philosophic sages, the ones who transcend communal wisdom. Now, Ogotomili wrote on the Dogon beliefs, but he did not quite, write anything unique about the Dogon beliefs, because they are basically, revolving around the same communal religious outlook. But someone like, for instance, Paul Mbuya Akoko. Paul Mbuya Akoko wrote, or rather talked about, he stated a rather pedestrian fact, that nature is uniform. A human being gives birth to a human being. A donkey gives birth to a donkey. Hercules gives birth to Hercules, so he basically seemingly made a significant, he stated significant thoughts. So he was classified as a philosophic sage because of this. Now we have had, various documented, philosophic sages and folk sages. We've had, for the philosophic sages, we've had Oruka Odera, who's my grandfather. We've had Stephen Danje, we've had Chaungu Baraza, we've had Okemba Simiyu Chaungu. We'll find out about them later. But the main point here is you understand the distinction between folk sages and philosophic sages. Back to Sodipo and Barry Hallen. The West African philosophers did not, give names of the people they interviewed, the sages. Now, the reason for this was, and you forgive me for this, is there a Nigerian in the house? Well, they had an agreement with the sages. No giving out their names because they are masters of medicine. All right? And this was a private trade which was not supposed to, they are basically not supposed to blow the cover of these sages because they are, witch doctors, in plain language. So that's why they didn't give reasons of the names of the sages. So the problem with this, as I said, you can't, make reference as opposed to, in comparison to the other project, the other Kenyan project. I'm feeling like I'm talking. So, as the professor advised, he wanted me to share a bit about my family as well. Well, apart from, dad, I have two brothers. One lives in Los Angeles, the other lives in Australia. I have two sisters in DC, and one adopted sister who works in Dubai. So, the only one. My brother in Los Angeles is an actor. If you watch the original, flash forward, there's a couple of things here there. The one in Australia is a computer engineer. Two sisters in DC are in hospitality. The one in Dubai is she works in a clinic. She's a doctor. So yeah. Yes. How many are you? Okay. Probably we should go into Q&A right now. Yeah. Okay. Who's what? Oh, it's Papa Tunde. Any other question? Question about the topic. For my mother, my dad had two wives. So basically, I have one blood brother, and the other side, I have one brother and two sisters, and possibly adopted sister. And next question. Yeah. How do I think polygamy? Well, I can relate to a lot. Oh, yeah. My granddad had 10 wives. One of the reasons he was classified as a sage is because he talked about freedom, or fuyango tuolo in Luo. And he said that one of the ways of becoming free is by being good to other people, or just, giving back. If you can feed a hungry person, then you're free. If you can be well behaved, then you're free. So this is one of the reasons why Oruka Ranginya, that was his name, Peter Oruka Ranginya. I'm called Peter for him. So this is one of the reasons why he was classified as a philosopher. But anyway, I'll tell you, 10 wives, 36 children. My dad was one of them. Yeah, and then dad only had 2 wives. My stepmother works for K International. My mom is an entrepreneur, former banker. In early 70s, she was a police officer, detective. Yeah. Next question. No, there were no solo kids. Because the cook was from Nyaka. My grandfather was from Ogeni. So yeah. Well, I wish I had time. Probably I'll get time today. Yeah. I know. How does it feel to be raised? It's how do I put it? How many know Mukomo and Gugi? Gugi are the son. Mukomo and Gugi. How many know Jamal Mazrui or Kim Ford Mazrui? Know Mukomo? Huh? So basically, you know, whether you like it or not, somehow you end up accidentally falling in love with, you know, just the whole, the idea of being an intellectual and living a meaningful life. Because, you know, it sort of opens your eyes because you live with someone who, you know, has a very broad mind and makes life much more interesting because, you know, not so many people think the way they do. So it's inspiring. You know. At the same time, it's kawa. Say that again? Omayo. Bro, I'm only, how old? The thing is, I'm young, so promise that will come back. I'm in my 20s. Oh, my name? Well, my name is Peter Oruka Odera Ching. I was born during the day. Ching is the sun, so yeah. Next question.
I think what I wanted to ask is sort of related to what he asked, is that after understanding, you know, or growing in the sage philosophy, what would you say is a major critique? How would you critique it?
Exactly. How would I critique? One way I would critique sage philosophy is how they classify the sages. It's easy for, say, a philosophic sage to fluctuate and, you know, or change and become a folk sage, because I may say something very profound. But the next time you meet me and ask me a question about something totally different, I'm not able to give you a very rational or well thought out answer. So, you know, they sort of go, they keep changing. You know, as folk sage can be a philosophic sage and vice versa. That's one of, you know, a very outstanding criticism of that.
Why do you think in Africa we have the philosophical sages, while in Europe it is philosophers and practice? I mean, why do we sound like the two kinds of philosophy?
All right. Let me just demystify that for you. We've had Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Socrates, and these were the ones, if you look at Black Antenna, these were the ones who are named the true philosophers, isn't it? But you see, this was a white male perspective. I call it white male because Europe was also, you know, patriarchal, whether, you know, they like to admit it or not before. So it's actually the same thing, only different. Because this time it's more valid because we have a distinction. Because the mistake the Greeks made was they didn't distinguish between the ones who were folk sages and philosophic sages, and that's what Africans did. So in my view, Africans even did better compared to the Europeans, because, you know, they actually you can actually have a comparison and, you know, distinguish between different kinds of philosophers, you know, because we have sages and we have, you know, we have a sage and we have a sage philosopher, but that, you know, that's a story for another day. But do you understand that? Exactly. I knew you'd come to that question. Is there any written documentation by these wise people? You see, the problem here is most of them, the point was going to traditional Africa. Alright? Look for the illiterate, illiterate wise people. Alright? So one of the arguments or criticisms of sage philosophy was that there was no written evidence or knowledge by these wise people. And that was one of the reasons why this project, you know, was done. To show that it's not, literacy is not a prerequisite for wisdom. you don't have to know how to write to be wise. So we don't have texts written by the cities themselves. It's the work of the professional philosophers to explicate the philosophical underpinnings of the non-professional philosophy.